They arrived with notebooks and neutral smiles, the way engineers do when they pretend to be tourists. Their guides spoke about safety rules, routing protocols, and the photo policy while the visitors nodded through an invisible fog of calculation. The gatehouse released them into a world that did not resemble a factory so much as a self-contained organism, a city that breathed in raw matter and exhaled automobiles. Coal barges nosed against the docks as if arriving on schedule to a train station, not a river. Ore carriers unburdened their holds with a hydraulically precise indifference. The air hummed, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, as if the entire complex had decided on a single pulse and set every heart to it. It is tempting to say they stood in silence because the sight stole their words. The truth is more severe. They stood quiet because language itself failed to compress what they were seeing into anything that could fit on paper. A blueprint isolates a machine. A memo isolates a method. This place refused isolation. A blast furnace did not merely melt ore. It conspired with rail switchers, with crane operators, with the quayside foreman eyeing the weather upriver. The rolling mill was not just a sequence of stands. It was a metronome for metal, its tempo dictating whether the stamping plant 500 yards away would starve or choke. And everywhere, signs in block letters that were not slogans but instructions, where to wait, where to stack, where to inspect, where to pull and rework. The choreography did not feel improvised. It felt practiced until the practice disappeared, and only rhythm remained. They had expected bigness, even spectacle. Germany had spectacle. Germany could arrange 1,000 workers into a living diagram for a photograph. What they had not expected was the ordinariness of the miracle. They saw parts arrive in the right color of crate. They saw gauges hanging from posts like pocket watches on chains. They saw a worker tighten 2 bolts and check a mark with a glance that lasted a heartbeat, then send the piece onward. Nothing looked secret. Everything looked obvious. The genius hid in how the obvious never failed. At the catwalk over the assembly line, they leaned out just enough to feel the breeze that a moving river of chassis throws against your chest. Bodies descended from overhead, slings with the calm of a practiced landing. Tires met hubs and turned once, caught by a hand, and kept turning toward the next station. A foreman watched the interval between cars the way a conductor watches the space between notes. The visitors scribbled a number, then a second number, then a subtraction. They tried to compute tact in their heads, to reconcile speed with human hands, to trace where buffers turned into cues and cues into starvation. They tried to spot the trick. They did not find one. The truth they discovered, if they discovered it at all, arrived sideways. A plant that boasts 1,000,000 parts is a journalist's sentence. A plant that never allows those parts to form a traffic jam is a doctrine. The visitors began to recognize doctrine in small things. A bin that was never quite full, therefore never in the way, a rework bay close enough to intervene, far enough to keep the main artery clean, a tool room where dull was not a complaint but a scheduled state, like rain in April. They saw the power station's dials, not theatrical but inevitable, the way a pulse oximeter is inevitable in an operating room. They saw a walled-off space where the real experiments happened, and another space that never changed because the experiment had already ended there 10 years ago, and the verdict was reliability. There were moments that made one of them glance at the others with the awareness that the day would divide their lives into before and after. A ladle poured iron and missed its mark by exactly 0, and a man with a hook corrected a flicker of surface tension with the casual authority of a chess grandmaster nudging a pawn. A checkpoint inspector flipped through control sheets whose columns had the dull names of saints. Diameter here, run out there, surface finish under a threshold that not even the camera in his counterpart's mind could focus on without training. An overhead conveyor switched lanes with a soft clack, and the car beneath it continued like a sentence guided by grammar you no longer need to think about to use correctly. What did they actually see? They saw a vertically integrated state whose constitution was scheduling. They saw a philosophy disguised as housekeeping. They saw the audacity of a company that built not merely cars but the conditions that make cars inevitable. They realized that the loudest boast in the complex belonged to the quietest fact. Nothing in this place waited for permission. Coal did not wait for ore. Ore did not wait for heat. Heat did not wait for rolling. Rolling did not wait for stamping. Stamping did not wait for paint. Paint did not wait for final. And final did not wait for sales, because sales had already been summoned by trains that would not apologize for leaving on time. If they stood in silence, it was because they were haunted by a paradox none of them could solve on a single visit. Machinery can be copied, and even copied quickly by disciplined technicians. What they were watching had taken longer than any espionage cycle. You cannot smuggle out a habit of mind in a briefcase. You cannot photograph coordination. You cannot steal time that has already been spent teaching a workforce to keep one another honest without argument. Before they left, one of them wrote a sentence that was more honest than he intended. There is no single secret. It reads like a confession because it is one. They exited near the yard where finished cars were staged in rows too neat to have been made at speed. A light rain stippled the paint. Someone joked about whether Americans had discovered a way to schedule the weather. No one laughed. They rode back to their hotel through a city that felt freshly invented, and one of them finally spoke. The comment was not praise. It was a verdict delivered softly enough that it sounded like exhaustion. The method is the product. That was the sentence they could not relay without explaining an entire nation's mood. The telegram that would go home could report numbers. It could not report that feeling, the sense that they had stepped inside a machine built to eliminate suspense. The cars would leave tomorrow. The coal would arrive tomorrow. The ore would pour tomorrow. Rhythm would survive any single man's absence. The visitors did not envy the Americans. They envied the rhythm. They left their visitor badges at the desk, and the guard dropped them in a wooden tray with a dozen others, evidence that today's ceremony had concluded with the same ordinary perfection as everything else in that precinct. From the street, the plant looked like a photo in a book, brick and windows and a smokestack steady as punctuation. Behind the brick, the choreography continued without them, as it would the next day and the day after. They had not discovered a trick to carry home. They had learned a rule. You cannot steal continuity. Begin at the river, because the river is the first conveyor. Barges shoulder in and give up coal, the dark battery that will be dissolved into heat and light. Ore carriers, with hulls scarred by 1,000 miles of lake weather, open their mouths and pour rusty-coloured stone onto hungry belts that vanish into the earth. Crane booms sketch trigonometry in the sky. Dock crews speak a vocabulary of hand signals older than radio. A clock somewhere starts counting not minutes but sequences, and the count will continue until a finished car snicks into gear and rolls onto a rail car bound for a dealer who has already sold it. Coke ovens work like fortresses in reverse, taking in the crude and surrendering the refined. There, discipline is strictly timed. Open too soon and you waste heat. Open too late and you birth ash. Out of that harvested heat comes the blast furnace's breath, a deep inhalation and exhalation that are the closest thing industry has to weather. Burden descends in measured doses. Ore, coke, limestone, repeated until the column becomes a story you can read on a pressure gauge. Taps are events. Runners glow. Slag sloshes off like a chore you do every morning because you have decided to live a tidy life. The visitors would later write that this phase felt like magic. It is not magic. It is the domestication of violent elements, rehearsed until the performance looks safe. Molten iron becomes steel the way a thought becomes a law. A change in composition alters what the future can ask of it. Heat treatment, forming, fatigue. In the open and hearth or the basic oxygen converter, whatever sits on the shop floor in this decade, crews move with the gravity of litigators reading statutes. There is noise, but it is not argument. Each action is a sentence that has already been negotiated. Ladles tip. Ingots are cast or continuous strands emerge, and the newborn metal must be taught to be a citizen. Rolled, normalized, straightened, tested. The rolling mill is the first place you see speed as virtue. There are numbers posted on walls that seem unimpressive until you understand that they are not goals but habits. Gauge holds because someone decided years ago that gauge will hold, and then built a culture with the patience to make it true. In the cold mill, the sheet learns manners. It is reduced, annealed, skin passed into a temperament fit for stamping dies that will not tolerate tantrums. Coil storage looks like a strange library where every book weighs a ton and every spine must align. Cranes drift overhead with more delicacy than their size should allow, threading steel through a maze of timing windows. If you want to understand why the plant behaves like a single organism, watch the way a coil finds its die without wandering. The routing is not intelligence. It is obedience to instructions so clear that error feels impolite. Stamping is the first act. Ordinary eyes can mistake for the whole play. A press cycles and a panel appears. The sound is declarative, a period at the end of a sentence whose beginning lies upriver. Try to imagine the negotiation that lets a piece of steel become a fender in one stroke and a door skin in the next. Die change is theatre, but also sacrament. The crew arrives like a pit team because seconds are not seconds here. They are inventory. Too many and you have waste. Too few and you have starving lines. The die locks, the press nods and panels begin falling like well-trained soldiers taking their places in formation. Body and frame come together in jigs that look like modernist sculptures of geometry's conscience. Welders work in bursts that resemble the punctuation of a telegram, heat stitching metal into a promise of stiffness. The jigs are not merely fixtures. They are teachers. They enforce shape the way grammar enforces meaning. A misfit here is not a misfit at all. It is an interruption that will echo downline as an argument about door sills. The plant hates arguments. It resolves them by preventing them. Paint feels like the first time the car becomes polite. The raw shell enters a bath that would drown a careless swimmer, then emerges wearing primer like a new mood. Spray booths sound like whispering storms behind glass. Robots would later inherit some of this work, but the ethos precedes any era's hardware. Patterns are set by men with eyes trained to see what catalogues cannot print. Orange peel is a phrase of insult here, not fruit. The shell gains its color, the kind of color that the sunlight will later approve in a dealer lot. Curing ovens hum. Time is consumed in a way that seems slow, until you remember that speed without adhesion is vanity. Meanwhile, far from the glamorous, operations that cameras enjoy, sub-assemblies are being coaxed into readiness. Engines are not born whole but in large families of parts who must learn each other's names. Gear sets are stacked with the superstition of men who have learned that teeth must respect one another. Instrument panels accrete wiring harnesses until they resemble the nervous systems they will soon regulate. Tires are mounted with the same casual grace with which you tie your shoes, a grace born of repetition that refuses to grow sloppy. Final assembly is the boulevard where everyone meets. Overhead carriers lower bodies onto frames with the fidelity of a ritual performed every hour in a shrine that believes in punctual gods. Seats enter. Glass slides into channels and seals with a small sigh. Fluids are injected as precise doses, as if the car were a patient and the nurse had memorized the chart. Engines fire and cough once, then smooth to a purr that is not music but compliance. At end of oval-line testers check lights, brakes, steering. The defects that do appear are treated as riddles to be solved upstream, not as scandals to be hidden. The car rolls forward under its own power, not triumphant, simply ready. The visitor who hopes to understand the place in an afternoon will be betrayed by the plant's politeness. The choreography refuses to grandstand. The miracle is that there is no grandstand. There is only a script too long to memorize in a single sitting, but so well written that each actor knows his line. The result is not merely production, it is forecast turned into fact. Dealer orders arrive as numbers. Scheduling turns the numbers into a month that will actually happen. Boxcars line up with the patience of cattle at a shoot. A whistle sounds and means something. The river knows when to be full. When you step back at the end of the route and try to retell what you saw, words betray you. You reach for metaphors like city, orchestra, organism, cathedral. They all fail because they imply a center where intention lives. Here, intention has been diffused into procedures and checklists that have been rehearsed until they no longer look like rules. They look like habits. And that, more than the brilliance of any single machine, is what makes the plant into a city. A city can suffer a broken light bulb without losing its memory. So can this place. Replace the bulb. Keep walking. The cars will not notice. Numbers arrive first like guests at a cocktail party, loud and a little shallow. Acreage dazzles, headcount impresses, output per day brags. Then, if you linger, the numbers begin to confide. They tell you that acreage is not a field to admire, but a path to shorten. They admit that headcount is not a crowd, but a curriculum that must be taught again every season. They reveal that output per day has less to do with heroics than with an oath sworn by maintenance at 3 a.m. when a bearing tries to quit. So yes, there is a card's worth of numbers one can rattle off, and the viewers will enjoy it, because a fast chorus of facts promises mastery. But the plant refuses to be mastered by recital. Begin with where. Dearborn matters because the river makes heavy material cheap to move, and because the rail junctions make finished product cheap to disperse. Geography here is not romance, it is arithmetic. The site was chosen like a chess move 3 turns in advance, with ore in mind, coal in mind, dealers in mind. Add up the docks, the spurs, the yard capacity, and you begin to see how a car can be promised to a city that is just a line on a map. Then consider power. On-site generation is not a brag. It is a doctrine against interruption, a renunciation of dependence on municipal hiccups. If a thunderstorm knocks a neighborhood dark, the plant's pulse does not stutter. Continuity is the ultimate luxury good, and the complex manufactures it for itself. Headcount looks monstrous when written as a single integer. Inside it resolves into guilds of competence. 1,000 in steel cannot step into trim. 100 in trim cannot run a soaking pit. Training pipelines operate with the patience of orchardists who understand that trees require years. Apprenticeships are not favors, but investments with actuarial certainty. This is why the visitors' notebooks filled with part numbers, and missed the fact that the most valuable inventory in the building was skill, and the second most valuable was trust. The press crew trusts that upstream steel will behave. Upstream trusts that the press will not abuse the gift. Between those mutual vows, scrap declines and tempo clarifies. Output per day is the statistic everyone loves because it reads like applause. A figure in the thousands sells newspapers, yet the truth that drives policy lives in a quieter ratio, minutes per station per unit. The plant buys those minutes the way a banker buys bonds, shaving here and investing there with a long view. A redesign of a jig that saves half a minute is not a footnote. It is a year of cars. A new arrangement of a parts supermarket that trims 30 paces per hour is not tidying. It is throughput raising its hand and asking to be noticed. Tucked time is the word a visitor learns when he wants to show he has been paying attention. But tucked is not a word. It is a promise that demand and capacity will acknowledge each other without drama. To uphold that promise, the complex builds buffers like shock absorbers, sized not by hunch but by arithmetic born from scars. Somewhere a whiteboard records the lessons of winter, of strikes in a supplier's town, of a flood that came on a Thursday and taught the receiving yard new manners. Those lessons become numbers, and the numbers tell men how many racks to pull to the line before lunch. In this way, what looks like a warehouse is actually a memory palace. Quality here is not a department. It is a superstition practiced by everyone. Gauges hang like rosaries in a chapel, touched not in fear but in habit. Acceptable runout, acceptable roughness, acceptable torque. These are not negotiable because negotiation would take time, and time is the one currency the plant refuses to counterfeit. Auditors do not patrol like police. They circulate like gardeners, pruning before the plant grows wild. A defect that escapes is pursued backward along the line until it is caught not at a culprit but at a cause. The cause is corrected and the story is added to the catechism. Capacity expansions read on a chart as a new wing, a new press, a new furnace. lived from the inside. They read as a re-ezecha campaign. New flow means old habits must be reconsidered, and the plant is ruthless about unlearning. It does not bow to tradition when tradition obstructs. It keeps traditions that serve cadence and discards those that merely serve nostalgia. This is why the complex always appears younger than its oldest brick. Its age is measured in how recently it updated its manners. Outside observers love to quote the figure for rail cars per day departing the yard. It is a beautiful number because it translates work into motion. You can film. The truer beauty lies in the number of rail cars that depart exactly when they were supposed to. Predictability, not scale, is the master virtue. Predictability makes suppliers brave and dealers honest. Predictability allows contracts to be promises instead of hopes. In war, predictability becomes a weapon that looks like boredom until you compare your pile of finished goods to your opponent's pile of waiting intentions. If this sounds like romance applied to arithmetic, forgive the tone. The plant invites a certain lyricism because it is the most human kind of machine, one that converts discipline into freedom. A worker in a chaotic shop is always a hostage to surprises. A worker in a place like this can plan a life without asking permission from failure. That stability accumulates in the product, as surely as paint accumulates on a product fender. The buyer who drives away is not merely purchasing steel and glass. He is purchasing the absence of drama that preceded his arrival on the lot. So the fast facts are real, and they can be read in 20 seconds if you wish to impress your friends at dinner. The slow telling is truer. Every number represents a negotiation already concluded in favor of order. The visitors intuited this without knowing how to write it. They would send a cable with handsome figures, and a ministry 2,000 miles away would read those figures like omens. But the prophecy hidden in them cannot be transplanted by policy decree. It must be built in the only way anything durable is built, inch by inch, habit by habit, until even a stranger can feel the rhythm without being told its name. Industrial intelligence wears a business suit. It checks into good hotels and asks polite questions on factory tours. It subscribes to trade journals and reads ads with the suspicion that ads sometimes tell the truth by accident. Between wars, it appears as a commercial attaché who hosts luncheons and collects gossip. In war, it puts on a uniform and continues the same work with a sterner face. The men who came to Dearborn at the edge of the decade sat somewhere on that spectrum, credentialed enough to walk in through the door, alert enough to notice what was not said aloud. They had a playbook. There were the legal methods, which could fill a bookshelf, public patents, technical papers, textbook adoptions, catalogues that accidentally revealed lead times. There were the tolerated methods, which required a cup of coffee and a gift for conversation. A foreman who liked to talk, a salesman who liked to brag, a machinist who liked to complain. And then there were the forbidden methods, which carried their own tautologies. If discovered, they would be denied because they had to be. The goal across all methods was the same: to convert suspicion into a ratio that a planning ministry could understand. How many units per day, per man, per horsepower, per square foot? How steady the cadence across storms and strikes? How fragile the supply lines? How honest the schedules? The watchers had learned the wrong lessons from earlier pilgrimages to other factories. Too often they had been seduced by a glittering piece of equipment and returned home with a part number in their pocket, certain that procurement could conjure parity by writing a check. This visit began with a pledge to resist seduction. And to their credit, they did resist, at least in the first hour. They moved as a pack that broke apart near interesting stations, and then reformed around a guide like iron filings drawn back to a magnet. They asked about maintenance intervals with a tone that suggested they were prepared to compliment. They asked about power redundancy as if power were a matter of taste. They asked about die life in a voice that would read on a transcript as respect. The guide was not naive. He knew these men had come for more than schoolbook knowledge. He also knew that the most valuable truths were safe to share because they were useless without the culture that animated them. He walked them through the sequence with the calm of a man introducing a guest to his domestic routine. Breakfast here, commute there, lunch at noon, because lunch at noon keeps the afternoon honest. They wrote it down as if he had revealed a code. He had revealed a preference for order. In the evening, the watchers did what watchers do. They reconstructed the day over maps and drinks, converting sights into diagrams, diagrams into claims, claims into sentences that might survive a superior's red pencil. They debated whether the complex's vertical integration was a strength or an indulgence. They argued about whether a dispersed supplier network with clever contracts could mimic the effect without the capital burden of owning one's own power station. One of them, younger, insisted that what mattered was not ownership but scheduling, not assets but obedience. He was outvoted on paper. He would be right in history. When they sent summaries home, the prose was confident. It always is. The figures were round enough to look authoritative. The adjectives were careful enough to appear sober. And yet, between the lines, a country's anxiety leaked. If this place exists, what must be built to counter it? If this tempo becomes national policy, what must a rival emphasize to avoid fighting on ground that has been chosen without permission? The watchers did not have the luxury of writing philosophy. They wrote logistics in sentences that tasted like sawdust. Their readers would later ask them why they had not identified the single point of failure. The watchers would attempt to explain that a system designed to distribute responsibility also distributes resilience. The point of failure does not sit still long enough to be mapped. There is a kind of silence that looks like admiration and is actually calculation. The men who toured the place wore that silence like a second tie. They were counting in a language that does not use numbers, the language of how long a habit takes to become a reflex. They understood secrecy. They practiced it themselves. What humbled them was not secrecy but transparency. The plant revealed itself confidently because revelation did not endanger it. If a visitor memorized the path a car took from bare frame to painted shell, what then? He could rebuild the path at home only by rebuilding the city that supported it, the schools that trained the hands, the suppliers that respected schedules, the unions that believed in tomorrow's raise more than today's quarrel, the railroads that treated punctuality as a religion and not a suggestion. Before they left town, one of them mailed a postcard to his wife. He wrote that he had seen something impressive and that he would explain when he returned. He did not explain, not fully, because to explain would have required telling a story about a nation's confidence. He described the size, because size is permissible. He omitted the mood, because mood is subversive. What he had witnessed was not just production. It was a culture that believed tomorrow could be scheduled. He could not write that through a censor's eye without sounding dangerous. So he sent a neutral sentence about weather, and he folded the rest of his thoughts into the quiet that men call professionalism and historians later call awe. They arrived just after the whistle, at that hour when the plant's first intake of breath becomes visible as motion rather than noise. The guard swung open a gate that seemed too small for what it was admitting, and 100 private rituals began at once. Boots found their marks on painted lines. Clipboards clicked shut with the finality of a judge's gavel. Lights came alive down alleys of steel like street lamps agreeing on dusk. The visitors stepped into a corridor that smelled of oil and soap, a compromise between power and cleanliness that every large factory strikes when it decides to be a place where humans can stand all day and still think. At the badge checkpoint, a man compared faces to tiny photographs without hesitation. His decisions were short not because he was careless, but because he knew his people the way a small town knows its weather. A woman in a blue coat nodded to him with the grave intimacy that workmates share when their tasks are separate but their fates are joint. Overhead, a chain conveyor traced an avenue at a stately pace, empty hooks clicking past like punctuation in a long sentence that the plant recites from memory. To step beneath it felt like entering grammar. They turned left into the press hall and the scale reset the story from tour to pilgrimage. Press crowns hovered like cliffs in weather. Uprights rose like architecture designed by gravity. The cadence of strokes gave the air a meter you could tap with your thumb against your notebook. Every sound was both a declaration and an acceptance. Dies met steel, Steel yielded to shape, and the die closed again with the satisfaction of a clean argument. If a clamp slipped a fraction, the tone betrayed it instantly, and hands moved without conference. Competence here was a choreography too practiced to advertise itself. The guide kept them to a painted footpath that curved around a fenced bay, where damaged panels confessed themselves to specialists. Through the chain link they watched a ritual that felt almost pastoral, a palm stroking a surface to find a ripple, a mallet persuading a flange back into the manners. A jig expects, a gauge confirming that the apology had been accepted. The bay's proximity to the artery carried a lesson bolder than any sign. Problems were invited to leave the line quickly, to be addressed by experts, to be prevented from breeding in public. They climbed to a catwalk, and the perspective turned spectacle into grammar. Below, the body line advanced with a serenity that mocked the word busy. Fixtures enclosed shells with the protective certainty of hands teaching a child to ride a bicycle. Sparks flowered in disciplined bursts and died before they could prove a point. A young man in a leather apron leaned into a lever like a compositor adjusting type. Once the stubborn bracket conceded, he did not grin. He moved. The foreman on the platform did nothing for a minute, and in that minute did everything that matters. He watched interval. He watched the conversation between stations conducted in the language of seconds. The plant was not shy about its lungs. The power station presented its dials without melodrama, fat needles and numbers that wore their seriousness like uniforms. An engineer explained redundancy the way a host explains politeness. Turbines do not brag. They deliver. When asked about storms, he shrugged like a farmer discussing rain. You survive weather by refusing to argue with it. Boilers muttered in the next room like old men who have seen every trick the season can play and intend to be amused by none of them. They crossed to paint in a small procession. The shell descended into dip tanks and rose baptized, not yet adorned but defended. Fans whispered and filters whispered. The first layer of colour arrived without ceremony, and the second arrived without regret. Ovens did their quiet arithmetic with temperature and time. A man walked through with a light in his hand and let the beam graze a curve. He did not call anyone over. He adjusted a note on a clipboard, and the note walked downstream ahead of him, like a messenger with a gentle voice. Final assembly possessed the mood of a boulevard. Overhead carriers lowered bodies onto frames with the fidelity of a ritual, and what might look like chaos from a distance resolved into polite conversations at arm's length. Seats found rails. Glass slid into channels. Harnesses married dashboards in embraces negotiated on drafting boards months ago. A woman with a torque wrench rotated her wrist until a small light approved her judgment. The light did not flatter. It recognized that a promise had been kept one more time. Lunch performed the day's only theatre, which was to pretend the world had paused. It had not. The line rested as a good river rests when the wind turns. Men and women peeled off to rooms of steam and coffee, where jokes were old and stories local. A maintenance lead walked the visitors past a vibration monitor and said it had predicted a failure yesterday that never occurred because prediction is a kind of prevention. His hands bore the polished scars of a man who loves bearings more than speeches. In the afternoon, the tour returned upriver to Steel. The furnace tapped and Orange argued with darkness until darkness conceded. The crew moved like men teaching gravity some new manners. If you stand in such a place long enough, you can feel a century trying to choose between the primitive and the polite. Here the choice had been made. What mattered was not that iron became steel. What mattered was that the moment was scheduled, that the schedule respected, that the schedule survived contact with heat. They ended at the yard where rails provided punctuation. A string of automobiles climbed a ramp with the humility of freight that knows its destiny. A clerk compared forecast to fact and did not sharpen his pencil. The figures agreed without theatrics. Pages were filled, numbers collected. Yet the image that would haunt them was a small gesture at a dock where a man tugged a tarp's corner taut. The tarp did not need to be perfect to keep the weather out. It needed to be honest. The gesture had that quality, and so did the place. The myth that a miracle plant is a trick of machinery collapses as soon as you watch the arithmetic at work. Pace is not a mood. It is a treaty between demand and capacity, negotiated in seconds and signed in silence. The word for that treaty is tact, borrowed from music and stripped of romance by the weight of promises. Tact is the interval at which the line must present a good unit if the company is to keep its oaths to dealers, quartermasters, and a nation that has learned to expect punctual miracles. Begin with cycle time. Cycle is intimate, the measure of how long a station needs to make the next good piece when the world minds its manners. Compare cycle to tact, and temperament appears. If cycle is shorter, a station breathes easily and offers a small act of generosity to its neighbor. If cycle is longer, deficit reveals itself first in posture and only then in numbers. Shoulders tilt forward. Eyes flick to clocks. A supervisor's presence grows gravitational. Arithmetic is merciless because it is fair. Buffers are manners made visible. They cushion a late arrival so that dinner is not ruined. Size them too small and you hear starvation. A station apologizing for nothingness. Size them too large and you curate a museum of waiting, where parts grow older without gaining wisdom. The numbers that govern buffers are probabilities, dialect, means and variances and correlations, and the plant keeps historians of winter and flood who remember which river froze in which week and what lesson the yard learned. Bottlenecks are not villains. They are truths. Every flow owns a constriction, a gate through which ambition must pass one unit at a time. The craft here is not to deny the bottleneck, but to be loyal to it. Identify it correctly, and you schedule with the peace of a navigator who knows the river's depth. Misidentify it, and lateness metastasizes into personal blame. In practice, the bottleneck wanders like weather, drawn to whichever station has inherited the least kindness. Yesterday it lived at a trim operat. The rules of a place like this are older than any sign on the wall. They begin as instincts: keep the aisles clear, keep the line moving, keep the questions short, and harden into policies when a plant decides to grow up. Visitors often imagine that secrecy is a product of paranoia. In truth, it is a product of courtesy, the courtesy owed to an operation that must not be interrupted by every curious hand that wants to poke at its pulse. A factory that large cannot live by suspicion alone. Suspicion is exhausting. It lives by agreements, many of them invisible, that sort knowledge into what must be shared to function and what must be shepherded to survive. If you could read the minutes of a decade's worth of meetings between security, production, engineering, and the office that choreographs public relations, you would see how the vocabulary of secrecy evolves from theatre to housekeeping. In the early years, the rules were dramatic, designed to discourage mischief by making examples of it. Cameras banned, sketches forbidden, tours escorted by men whose eyes announced that the tour could end at any moment. Then reality intervened. The plant learned that it needed to show itself selectively because recruitment demanded it, and sales loved the spectacle of order. So the rules changed from no to yes, but only if. Yes, if the route avoids the bottleneck that wanders like a shy animal. Yes, if the questions concern upstream glory and not downstream fragility. Yes, if notes capture facts without context, the safer kind of truth that cannot be misapplied without the glue of experience. There were formal instruments, badges in colours that meant more to the guards than to the men wearing them, signatures that signified not trust but accountability. A visitor registered his company and, if he was honest, his curiosity. The plant registered him as a moving variable with the potential to disrupt cadence. Schedules for tours were stacked between shift changes and maintenance windows, threaded through the day like a surgeon's timetable: see, admire, and be gone before the part of the organism that dislikes observation begins to bristle. The men who wrote those schedules were not dramatists. They were students of variance. A tour that lingers can magnify a small delay into a mischief that wanders downline. There were informal instruments too, as decisive as any rulebook. A glance from a foreman could freeze a too ambitious question in the air. A hand over a clipboard could lower curiosity to a safe temperature. The plant trusted these gestures because they grew from a culture that had learned to protect momentum. A traveller cannot stop the wind to ask what it thinks about the trees. He can only watch the branches and infer. In the same way, a visitor here learned that whatever could be explained without metaphor was probably unimportant, and that whatever required a metaphor to be understood should not be explained at all. Unions were partners in this choreography. They wanted wages and conditions that dignified the day, and they also wanted a plant that would still be hiring next year. That meant protecting the integrity of the work from the kinds of meddling that arrive with clipboards and an eagerness to optimize the wrong thing. On this subject, labor and management found an unexpected friendship. The union steward who walked a line of strangers past a bench where a veteran machinist's hands were teaching a die to behave did not need a memo to know what not to discuss. The machinist had earned the right to work without becoming an exhibit. Respect policed revelation more effectively than suspicion ever could. The legal framework outside the gate mattered, but not as much as the habits inside it. Laws against industrial espionage could punish thieves. Standards committees could publish tolerances and give the world a vocabulary to discuss precision. Procurement offices could write contracts that demanded interchangeability and thereby forced suppliers to learn the plant's manners. Yet the decisive governance lived in an ethos that decided what the word we meant. We did not mean executives, we meant the people who felt a line's cough and reached for wrenches before anyone had time to translate that cough into a memo. Secrecy, under this definition, was simply a way of keeping promises to one another without the embarrassment of announcing those promises on paper. Now and then a story would scuff along the floor about a man who had tried to learn too much too quickly. He would ask for layouts as if the map could replace the walk. He would ask for die lists as if the names of tools were reasons. He would ask about suppliers as if knowing the address of a foundry equaled knowing its character. Politeness would handle him first, and then the rules would. His tour would remain within the lanes painted for people who still believed that scale can be summarized. He would leave with a head full of nouns and no verbs, which is to say he would leave knowing less than he had hoped. The plant, for its part, made a habit of revealing the safest important thing: cadence. You could see the line. You could hear the seconds tip into product. You could watch how rework was handled and infer that error did not magnify into shame. You could smell cleanliness and interpret it as confidence. These were gifts, but not careless ones. To show cadence is to brag humbly. It says, "We are not afraid of being observed because our advantage is the time already invested in making today possible. You cannot apprehend that time unless you lived it with us." The arrangement worked because it was mutual. Visitors learned what they could and promised what they had to. The plant gained the benefits that accompany selective publicity: easier hiring, prouder suppliers, a public that read a photograph of buckets of molten iron as evidence of national competence. When the world darkened into war, the rules were tightened because they had to be, and badges grew sterner, and clipboards sprouted clauses. But the essence did not change. Governance remained a form of manners. Protect the line, respect the craft. Keep the rhythm safe from any curiosity that cannot tell the difference between admiration and interference. The file survives as a bundle of pages in a drawer that once belonged to a ministry with a different name. The pages are tidy, written by men who had been taught that clarity is a gift to one's superiors and to history. The first report is the most confident because it was written quickly, while the heat of the tour still flushed through the sentences. It lists numbers the way a parade lists regiments, with banners and drums, docks measured in yardage, rail spurs counted like arteries, pressed tonnages tallied until the reader could be forgiven for thinking that steel obeyed the writer personally. The conclusion is generous in its admiration and stingy in its specificity, a contradiction born of haste. It says, "There is greatness here, and we can have it soon." The second report is humbler. It arrives after the writer has slept and met his own skepticism in the mirror. He begins to confess uncertainties. He admits that the line did not look fast so much as inevitable. He wonders whether inevitability can be purchased. He notices that the men in maintenance spoke to one another like historians, referring to last winter's vibration and the spring before last spindle bearing, as if seasons were characters in a novel and the machines were their temperaments. He writes a sentence that sounds like an apology. We saw no secret. We saw the absence of surprises. A memorandum follows from an attaché who did not visit but listened closely to those who did. His talent is synthesis. He converts the raw notes into claims that a planning office can digest. He proposes that we can mimic the effect of vertical integration without the capital burden of building our own power by composing stricter contracts. He argues that the essence is not ownership but alignment. If coal and ore and steel and stamping and assembly can be made to behave as if they were departments of one company through the magic of penalties and incentives, then the result will rhyme with what we saw without matching its architecture. The memorandum glows with the optimism of a man who believes that paper can substitute for culture. Paper can do much. It cannot carry history. Another file, slender and precise, records an admirer's attention to scrap. He writes not about triumphs but about how the plant apologized to itself. He notes with almost domestic affection the way crooked panels are pulled aside and educated instead of being allowed to humiliate the line. He praises the discipline with which scrap is segregated into categories that predict its reuse. He envied not the speed but the absence of shame around error. He writes that the plant treats defects as information about tomorrow. When the file circles through offices that prefer their industry to glitter from a distance, this admirer's notes are received with polite confusion. The glitter they want cannot be built from yesterday's mistakes. They miss the point and congratulate themselves for doing so. The copies that travelled home by diplomatic pouch acquired stamps, signatures, and a melancholy fragrance of paper that knows it will live in darkness. Some of those pages found their way to factory directors who read them with hostility or relief, depending on their temperaments. Hostility when the report seemed to accuse them of not being enough, relief when the report seemed to say that the problem was not their incompetence but the other side's head start. A director in a provincial city scribbled in the margin of one such report, a sentence that has survived only because his ink was good. We can copy a press, who will teach us to copy patience. Years later, when history had finished its loudest arguments, researchers would open those files and feel an intimacy with men they could not meet. The writer's pride and worry are still on the page, living creatures that outlast cause and outcome. Even the errors are human in the best sense. A claim about die life that shows more hope than evidence. A timeline that insists construction can be compelled to the pace of a speech. A vision of rail schedules that imagines trains as the kind of soldiers who obey even when the track is underwater. To read the files is to understand that imitation is a talent and that theft is clumsier than legend claims. The men thought they were stealing. In fact, they were translating, and some truths refuse translation without losing the meaning that mattered. One memo, unsigned, has the tone of a confession. It admits that the visitors felt envy, not of wealth, but of ease, not of equipment, but of chores done without drama. The writer remembers a worker at a bench who made a small adjustment to a bracket with a file whose handle fit his hand like an heirloom. The adjustment took 3 seconds. The writer says that in his own country that adjustment would have required a supervisor's attention and a form signed in triplicate, or else it would have been done in secret, and the secret would have grown into a disease. Here it was neither forbidden nor heroic. It was allowed because it was rational. The memo ends there, not with a recommendation, but with a sigh. When a nation chooses its industrial temperament, it also chooses the shape of its wars. Brilliance is intoxicating. It produces machines that look like claims you can photograph, machines whose cross-sections make engineers smile the way poets smile at a metaphysical conceit. Output is not intoxicating. It is reliable. It produces machines that arrive on time and in numbers that turn speeches into arithmetic. The visitors who stood in silence, in a plant where rhythm outshouted pride, could not know, though perhaps they felt, how that rhythm would translate when factories learned to pronounce their sentences in the language of war. On one side of the ocean, the designers loved tolerances the way a violinist loves a high note held to the edge of pain. It is not fair to call such love vanity. It was often virtue. A tank with a turret that turned like a wristwatch is a marvel in a museum and a comfort to a crew that trusts its bearings more than it trusts weather. An aircraft engineered as if flight were a poem about lift will make a music that visiting pilots will recount for years. Yet in war, the virtues must report to logistics. A brilliant machine that arrives late is a promise smashed on an anvil. A good machine that arrives in abundance has a habit of changing maps. The numbers that mattered were not the hero counts in the newspapers, but the steady ratios in the factory. Hours per airframe, minutes per engine, days between overhaul. A doctrine that favored maintainability multiplied itself at the front, where men with grease on their hands decided whether to curse or praise the people who had designed the thing in pieces small enough to understand. Replace a component in 3 minutes with a tool roll and a prayer, and you grow brave. Replace it in a day with a machine that only a depot owns, and you grow careful. The front line favors bravery for the first weeks of a war and respects carefulness for the last years. Output leans toward bravery that does not look like madness because it is backed by a warehouse. War also has a taste for forgiveness. In factories that practiced predictability, parts forgiven one another's small sins. A bolt accepted a dowel that had lived a rougher week. A bearing tolerated a partner that had been assembled at speed by hands that trusted gauges and therefore trusted themselves. The opposite temperament, the one that demanded perfection as solidarity, performed doomed romances with the field. Perfection suffered insult poorly, the insult of dust, the insult of cold, the insult of a spanner wielded by a boy who had learned the trade last month in a tent because a tent was what the budget would allow. Machines that forgive are slower in the showroom. They are faster in retreat, and retreat is not always a confession. Sometimes it is a tactic for which you need engines that do not quit when mud argues with ambition. At the scale of nations, output won arguments that brilliance thought were settled. Railheads filled with crates that did not miss their trains. Depots learned to behave like tributaries to a river that had discovered how to name its bends. Pilots and drivers began to speak of replacement not as a tragedy, but as a fact. Lose a machine and another will come. Lose 100 and the next 100 will carry the same bolts that your hand already knows. Confidence is not a moral virtue in war, but it is a tactical one, and factories that had taught themselves to despise suspense exported that lesson to men who could not afford to be suspenseful when the morning arrived cold and the order arrived simple. This is not to say that brilliance lost. It did not. Brilliance taught, terrified, seduced, and, in narrow corridors of battle, dominated. But brilliance as policy requires a peace that nurtures it with time and patience. Output as policy survives both peace and war because it owns the calendar. If you can schedule tomorrow, you can promise a division that its spares will find it even if the road goes missing for a day. If you can schedule next month, you can plan campaigns that depend on the train that has not yet left the city you have not yet secured. The miracle plant was not a factory. It was a calendar keeper disguised as a building. What the visitors carried home then was more than envy. It was a small map of consequences. They had seen a place that could teach a nation to make boredom into a weapon. They would return to offices that believed weapons had to glitter to matter. They would argue, and sometimes they would win, and sometimes they would be told that history wanted sheen and not schedule. History does not care. It blesses the temperament that shows up on time and invents rituals that can survive a winter of mud, a summer of dust, a night when the power fails, and a man with a lamp remembers that he is the last redundancy. Silence can mean respect. It can mean fear. It can mean that a man has found himself in a cathedral he did not expect and refuses to spoil the air. The silence of those visitors meant none of these exactly. It meant that they had discovered their vocabulary was mismatched to the object. They had come prepared to see machines. They had seen a mood. They had come to sketch layouts. They had witnessed a choreography whose steps were printed on people, not paper. You cannot describe a mood in figures without doing violence to both. They left the gate and did not talk because to talk would have required deciding which parts of the day were the story and which were ornament. The truth refused such cuts. The ornament was the story. The neat rows of finished cars waiting under a sky that promised rain were not a flourish. They were a promise made visible. The steady glow of the power station's dials was not background. It was the only proof that tomorrow would trust today. A man tugging a tarp's corner tight was not incidental. He was the definition of the place, a human being refusing to allow weather to negotiate with duty. In the hotel that evening, the first words anyone dared were small and practical. Where to eat, when to wire home, whether the train tomorrow would leave from the station with the iron columns or the modern one with the new platforms. The big words would not obey. Efficiency would not come when called. Scale hid under the bed like a child who does not want to put on his shoes. One of them tried boldness and said, simply, that they were behind. The others let the sentence stand without embroidery. It felt like the kind of truth men are allowed to say once, and then they must either act or learn to live with pretending it was not spoken. Later, when they had found their way home and resumed the life of offices, the silence survived in the spaces between certain words. When they wrote cadence, they paused before the C, as if the letter wanted a bow. When they wrote schedule, their hand pressed harder on the S, as if the strength of the line could be improved by the pressure of ink. When they wrote training, they put a halo around it, in the form of budget estimates that were suddenly less stingy than last season's. Their superiors, reading, felt the mood as a draft in the room but blamed the window. Years turned the memory from pain into instruction. The men taught younger men to resist the seduction of single answers. They said that the impressive thing about a place like that was not the press so tall, you had to climb a staircase to shake its hand, nor the furnace that spoke in orange sermons. It was the way the unpleasant parts of work had been planned for, until they became bearable. The waiting, minimized. The rework, dignified. The errors, anticipated. When a culture accomplishes this, conversation itself changes. People speak less dramatically and more precisely. They ask better questions and accept smaller triumphs. The place appears dull. It is not. It is the thrilling dullness of a machine that knows how to keep a promise. If there is a single sentence for the day, it is this: you cannot steal continuity. Continuity is the slowest thing a factory makes, and the most valuable, the thing that gives a country the right to believe that tomorrow will resemble today unless it decides otherwise. Continuity lives in training logs and maintenance charts, and the posture of a woman with a torque wrench who trusts the light that tells her enough. Continuity is ensured not by guards with pistols, but by a janitor who knows which aisle must be free by 6 or the morning will limp until noon. You can photograph such people. You cannot smuggle the photograph into a habit. The silence has been misread by romantic historians as awe. It was respect's quieter cousin. Comprehension withheld until it could be honored by action. What would action have been? To walk back across the ocean and say to a continent craving triumph that the triumph it craved would only come from learning to love chores. To persuade men raised on heroics to admire maintenance. To teach departments to value the gentle tyranny of the calendar. To design machines as if the man with grease on his knuckles was a collaborator and not a distant servant. To build 1,000 boring controls and bless them as miracles. It is possible. It only looks impossible when written as a speech. The plant goes on. It is the least dramatic ending a storyteller can offer, and the most faithful. A gate opens at dawn. Boats nudge docks. Rails sing. Presses breathe. Paint cures. A clerk compares forecast to fact and nods. Somewhere in a small office, a meeting adjourns after agreeing to change nothing because nothing needs changing today. Somewhere else, in a room with a lathe and a calendar, a foreman explains to an apprentice that the 6th of next month will be like the 5th, because the 5th will have taught them how to be the 6th. This is not poetry. It is the prose a civilization writes when it has decided to keep its oaths. As for the visitors, their silence ended in different ways. One spoke it aloud to a friend in a cafe and was told not to be dramatic. One buried it in reports that were read by men without imagination and filed by men too busy for metaphor. One carried it home and taught his son to love the word enough more than the word perfect. History will never add their names to the role of innovators, and they would not deserve it. They were not innovators. They were witnesses. Witnesses are rarely saints and never idols. They are merely the people who learned the shape of a truth and failed to forget it. That is enough. The last image belongs to the plant, not to them. A car rolls off the line and does not gasp at its own birth. It idles and waits for instruction. It will be told where to go by schedules older than itself and promises older than its buyer. Someone will drive it into weather that does not care about metaphors. Somewhere, a hand will tug a tarp tight. The gesture will be perfect in the only sense that matters. It will be enough to keep the rain out. The plant taught that gesture to a nation. The visitors stood in silence because they understood that teaching cannot be stolen. It can only be learned, and learning takes the one commodity no spy can compress: time.